The night my son officially opened the doors to his dream restaurant without me was the night I finally stopped being the family's private ATM. I didn't realize it at that exact moment, of course. All I knew was that I was sitting in my quiet kitchen in Indianapolis, staring at my phone and waiting for a text or a photo that was never going to come. I had spent months helping him get that place ready, and I was just waiting for the signal to come over and celebrate. I eventually got tired of waiting and decided to call him. "Hey, Leo," I said when my son finally picked up after the fourth ring. I could hear a lot of noise in the background, loud music, people laughing, and the distinct clinking of glasses. "I was just calling to see when the grand opening starts. I want to get there early to help you set up. Maybe wipe down some tables or take some photos for the website." There was a long, awkward pause on the other end. I could hear Leo breathing, but he didn't say anything. Then, a different voice slid onto the line. It was Megan, my daughter-in-law. Her voice was smooth and sounded like it was coated in sugar, but there was always something sharp underneath it if you listened closely enough. "Hi, David," she said. "The opening was actually last night." I felt the phone slip slightly in my hand. I switched it to my other ear, wondering if I had heard her correctly. "Last night?" Leo told me the date hadn't been set yet. "I thought you were doing a soft opening for friends and family first." She cut me off before I could finish. "It was very intimate, David. We only invited the important people, the initial investors, some local food bloggers, and a few influencers who can actually help the business grow. You know how it is. Space is limited and we had to keep it tight. We'll do a little family thing later on when things calm down. Anyway, I've got to go. Customers are waiting." The line went dead before I could even respond. I stood there in the middle of my kitchen, holding a silent phone that suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Outside, the streetlights were flickering on over the sidewalk that I had shoveled for 15 years so Leo could do his paper route when he was a kid. "Only important people," I repeated quietly to the empty room. I looked around my house. It's a modest, paid-off brick box that my late wife, Martha, had filled with warmth, crochet blankets, and framed family photos. On the refrigerator, there was still a faded drawing Leo had made in the 3rd grade. It was a picture of him and me standing next to a lopsided dog, both of us drawn as stick figures with giant, looping smiles. Apparently, back then, I was an important person. Now, I was just the man who had taken $15,000 out of his retirement savings to help them sign the lease on that building. I was the one who had co-signed the small business loan because the bank didn't think Leo's credit history was worth the paper it was printed on. I was the one who spent every weekend for 6 months at the hardware store buying lumber, sealant, and light fixtures. Every time a bill came up, they'd look at me and I'd say, "Put it on my card. I'll handle it," while they sat in the corner talking about branding and vibes and how to go viral on social media. I had built the tables they were sitting at. I had painted the walls that were currently surrounding those important people. But I wasn't important enough to be in the room when they finally cut the ribbon. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my old recliner, the one with the duct tape on the armrest, and stared at the dark TV screen. Memories kept hitting me in waves. I remembered the first time Leo said, "Dad, if this place takes off, I'm going to pay you back for everything." I remembered the way Megan used to kiss my cheek and call me their silent partner. I realized then that silent partner was just code for bank account that doesn't ask questions. Every time my Social Security check hit the bank, it felt like my phone would buzz almost on cue. "Hey, Dad, we're a little short on the liquor license fee. Dad, the dishwasher broke, and we'll lose the weekend crowd if we don't fix it right now." And I always found a way to help. I canceled fishing trips. I put off fixing my own leaky roof. I even sold my old '69 Mustang, the car I had planned to restore for years, just to cover a surprise tax bill they couldn't pay. Because that's what fathers do, right? But sitting in the dark that night, the silence of the house felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was the kind of silence that happens right after something precious has been broken. I realized that I wasn't being a supportive father. I was being a safety net that they were using to walk all over me. A week later, almost to the minute, my phone rang again. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. I picked it up, and I could hear the stress in Megan's voice immediately. The sugary tone was completely gone, replaced by that sharp, entitled edge I had come to recognize. "David, listen," she said, speaking too fast. "The bank just called. The main loan payment bounced, and they're threatening us with penalties. We thought you had already transferred the funds into the business account this morning. What happened?" I let her words hang there in the air for a long time. Usually, my chest would have tightened up with anxiety. I would have been fumbling for my keys and my checkbook, apologizing for the delay and promising to fix it immediately. But something inside me had shifted since the night of the grand opening. The unimportant man was tired. I took a slow, deep breath. "Megan," I said, my voice sounding incredibly calm, even to my own ears. "Didn't I mention it? I've decided that I only help important people now." For a long moment after I spoke those words, there was absolutely nothing on the other end of the line. No background music, no bustling kitchen sounds, not even the sound of Megan breathing. It was a silence so heavy and so absolute that I could actually hear the rhythmic thumping of my own heart in my ears. It was the sound of a bridge burning, and for the first time in 4 years, the smoke didn't make me want to cough. It felt like fresh air. "David, what is that supposed to mean?" Megan finally snapped, her voice coming back with a venomous edge that she usually tried to hide. "We're drowning here. The restaurant is our entire future. Leo is your only son. For heaven's sake, how can you be so petty over a few seats at an opening?" I looked down at my hands. They were weathered, calloused from years of hard work, and slightly trembling, but I felt a strange, cold clarity. "I know exactly who he is, Megan," I replied, my voice steady. "And for the last 4 years, I've treated both of you like you were the only future I had. I've lived my life around your emergencies and your crises, but the important people can handle the bank today. Good luck." I hung up before she could get another word out. My hand was shaking as I set the phone face down on the table, but it wasn't out of fear. It was something else, something colder and much more final. I walked over to the hallway closet and pulled out my old metal lockbox, the one where I kept the important papers. I brought it back to the kitchen table, the same table where my wife Martha and I used to help Leo with his math homework 20 years ago. I spent the next 3 hours going through everything. Bank statements, loan papers, scribbled receipts, and every single digital transfer I had made since this dream of theirs began. I found a yellow legal pad and a fresh pen. "Let's see exactly how unimportant I am," I muttered to the quiet kitchen. I started adding it all up, line by line. $500 for a surprise plumbing issue. $1,200 for a marketing consultant Megan insisted they needed. $3,000 for the deposit on the industrial oven. $800 here, $1,500 there. Most of these were accompanied by texts that said things like, "You're a lifesaver, Dad," or "We'll have you over for a private 5-course dinner as soon as we open." I realized now that the lifesaver was just a person they used to keep from sinking while they swam toward a life that didn't include me. By the time I wrote the final number at the bottom of the page, my coffee had gone cold and my shoulders were aching from the tension. The number was $45,200. That was the price of being the unimportant person in my own son's life. $45,000. That was money Martha and I had saved for our someday trips. That was the money that should have been fixing my sagging back porch or replacing the furnace that had been rattling for 3 winters. I sat back in my chair and stared at that number until it started to blur. And for the first time since Martha's funeral, I cried. It wasn't a quiet cry either. It was the kind of deep, ragged sobbing that comes when you finally realize you've been lighting yourself on fire to keep people warm who wouldn't even give you a seat at their table. When the tears finally stopped, the number on the page hadn't changed, but something inside me had. A boundary had been drawn. The first faint outline of a man who was done paying for the privilege of being ignored was starting to take shape. The next morning, I woke up at 6 a.m. without needing an alarm. Martha used to say that the quiet before the world wakes up is the only time you can really hear your own thoughts, and for once she was right. I stood in the kitchen, staring at that yellow legal pad in the soft morning light. $45,200. In the daylight, the ink looked even darker and heavier. My phone was sitting on the counter, face down. It had been vibrating intermittently until nearly midnight. Leo had called 3 times, Megan twice, then a couple of unknown numbers that I knew were just them trying to get around a potential block. I hadn't answered a single one. For 4 years, I had trained myself to jump every time that phone buzzed. If your kid is in trouble, you go. That's the unspoken rule of fatherhood. Whether they're 6 years old and lost a shoe or 35 and lost their business, you're supposed to be the one who fixes it. But that morning, I just poured my coffee and watched the phone light up again with a new text message. I didn't open it. Instead, I went upstairs, put on a clean button-down shirt and my good jeans. I didn't do it because I had a date or a meeting. I did it because I needed to feel like a man who still had a shred of self-respect left. I drove down to the local bank branch on Main Street. The air had that crisp, early morning chill that makes you wish you'd grabbed a heavier jacket. I walked through the sliding glass doors and was immediately hit by that familiar bank smell. A mix of industrial carpet cleaner, stale coffee, and printer ink. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," the teller said with a warm smile. I'd been banking there for 25 years, and they knew me by name. "You're in early today." "Yeah," I said, leaning against the counter. I figured I'd beat the rush. "Is Luis in?" Luis was the branch manager. He was the one who had helped me set up the initial wire transfers for Leo's lease. I remember him shaking my hand back then and telling me how lucky Leo was to have a father who supported his dreams so fully. At the time, I had beamed with pride. Today, the word supportive felt more like gullible. Luis looked up from his desk when I knocked on his open door. "Mike, good to see you," he said, standing up to shake my hand. "How's the restaurant business treating you? I saw the posts online. Looks like a big hit." "Actually, Luis, that's why I'm here," I said, sitting down in the leather chair across from him. I pulled out the yellow legal pad. "I need to cancel every single automatic payment, every recurring transfer, and every bit of overdraft protection connected to my son's business accounts." Luis's eyebrows shot up. He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from professional friendliness to genuine concern. "That's a pretty major move, Mike. Are you sure? If I pull the overdraft protection and their account hits 0, their checks will start bouncing immediately." "I'm positive," I said, my voice not wavering for a second. "I've spent $45,000 being their safety net, Luis, and I just found out that I'm not important enough to even be invited to the opening. My retirement isn't a Kickstarter campaign for people who treat me like a stranger." Luis stared at me for a long beat. Then he nodded slowly. "I see," he said quietly. He turned to his computer and started typing. For the next 20 minutes, we went through the accounts with surgical precision. We cut the business credit line where I was the guarantor. We stopped the $800 monthly stabilization transfer. We unlinked my personal savings from their business checking. With every click of his mouse, I felt a physical weight lifting off my chest. "Okay, Mike," Luis said as the printer started humming. "It's done. I'll keep these records on file. If anyone tries to restart these using your name, the system will flag it and I'll call you personally." He hesitated, then looked at me over his glasses. "I see this more often than I'd like to admit, Mike. Parents draining themselves for adult kids who have big plans but no gratitude. It usually ends one of 2 ways." "How's that?" I asked. "Either the kid finally grows up because they have no choice, or the parent goes under with them," he said. "It's good to see someone choosing a third option." I thanked him and walked out of the bank. On the drive home, I did something I knew would hurt, but I had to do it. I drove past the restaurant. They had a brand new neon sign out front, the Copper Spoon, and the patio heaters were already set up for the evening crowd. I could see the warm glow of the designer lights inside, lights I had paid for on my own credit card. I pulled over across the street and opened my phone. I went to their Instagram page. There was a photo from 2 nights ago. Leo was behind the bar, laughing and shaking a cocktail tin. Megan was next to him, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, holding a glass of champagne. The caption read, "Asterisk, grand opening was a dream. So grateful for our amazing team and our favorite, most important supporters who made this night possible. Star. I wasn't in any of the photos. My name wasn't in the caption. I was just the man across the street in a 10-year-old truck, watching the important people enjoy the house I had built for them. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt finished. I hit the block button on their account and put the truck in gear. The quiet in the car on the way home felt different now. It wasn't empty. Felt like the beginning of something new. The next day, the silence I had been enjoying was finally broken. I had known it was coming, of course. You don't just cut off the lifeblood of a struggling business and expect the owners to go away quietly. I had spent the morning nursing a second cup of coffee, sitting at the same kitchen table that now felt more like a fortress than a piece of furniture. I was mentally preparing myself, trying to find that same cold clarity I'd felt at the bank. I knew that the second Leo realized the money wasn't there, he wouldn't call. He would show up. He always did when he needed something fixed. By noon, the knock finally came. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic tap of a neighbor or the friendly, "Hey Dad, you home?" that Leo used to shout back when Martha was still alive and the world made sense. No, this knock was sharp, insistent, and heavy. It was the kind of knock someone uses when they feel like they're being unfairly locked out of something they own. I didn't get up right away. I stayed in my chair for a few seconds, breathing slowly, listening to the frantic energy on the other side of the wood. 3 hard hits, a pause, and then 3 more. "Dad, open the door. I know you're in there." Leo's voice was muffled, but I could hear the panic vibrating through it. I took my time walking to the hallway. I wasn't nervous, which surprised me. Usually, whenever Leo was upset, my first instinct was to scramble to make it better. But today, my chest felt steady. I had crossed a line inside myself, and there was no going back over it. When I finally pulled the door open, the tension outside was almost physical. Leo was standing there looking like a wreck. His hair was a mess, like he'd been running his hands through it all night, and he smelled faintly of old fryer grease and cigarettes, even though he'd promised me a dozen times he'd quit smoking. Megan was standing right behind him, her arms crossed tight over her chest and her eyes like chips of ice. She didn't say hello. She didn't offer a fake smile. She just looked past me into my house, her face set in a mask of practiced outrage. "Dad," Leo said, pushing his way inside before I could even invite them in. "We need to talk. Right now." I stepped back to give them space, but I didn't go far. I closed the door and turned the new deadbolt with a soft, final-sounding click. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my voice as flat as possible. Megan didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. "The bank called us this morning, David. They said you canceled the overdraft protection and the automatic transfers. All of them. The account is flagged." Her voice was high and sharp, cutting through the quiet of my house. "That's right," I said. Leo spun around to face me, his eyes wide. "Why would you do that? You didn't even give us a heads up. Do you have any idea what that does to our operations? We have vendors to pay, Dad." I looked him straight in the eye. "Why would you open your restaurant without telling me?" For a second, Leo actually looked ashamed. His jaw worked back and forth, but no words came out. He looked like the little boy who'd been caught lying about a broken window, unable to find an excuse that made any sense. But Megan didn't have that problem. She stepped forward, her heels clicking loudly on my linoleum floor. "That was a business decision, David," she snapped, as if using the word business made it okay to treat a father like a stranger. "We had investors there. We had media people. We had influencers who could actually make or break our reputation in Indianapolis. It wasn't about you. It was about the brand. But this," Leo added, waving his hand toward the kitchen, "this is personal. This puts us in a total crisis. We're in the middle of our first big week, and you're pulling the rug out from under us." Crisis. The word made me want to laugh. How many times had I dropped everything? My plans, my comfort, my own bills, to fix one of their crises? Every time they overspent or forgot a deadline, it became my emergency. My savings had been disappearing into a black hole labeled urgent for 4 years. "How much do you need?" I asked, not because I was going to give it to them, but because I wanted to see if they had any limit to their nerve. Leo hesitated, but Megan didn't miss a beat. "We need $3,000 by Monday morning," she said firmly. "We're behind on a couple of invoices, and we have to cover payroll for the new servers." "Payroll?" I repeated. "You've already hired a full staff? You can't even pay your light bill without me? But you're hiring people." Leo shrugged, looking defensive. "We need a team, Dad. We can't do everything ourselves if we want to be a top-tier spot." "No," I corrected him. "You can't do everything yourselves because you've always had me to pay for the help. You spend money you don't have because you assume I'll always be there to fill the gap. Isn't that the truth?" The room went silent. Megan's face was turning a blotchy red. "David, don't be dramatic. You know the copper spoon is our entire future. It's for the family." "And I'm not your family?" I asked. "Or am I just the bank?" Leo rubbed his face with his hands, looking exhausted. "Dad, come on. This isn't personal. It's just how things are right now." "It's personal to me," I said. My voice didn't rise. I didn't shout. I just spoke the truth, and the more calmly I said it, the more uncomfortable they both looked. I walked over to the kitchen table, picked up that yellow legal pad with the final total of $45,200 written at the bottom, and handed it to Leo. He looked confused at first, his eyes scanning the lines of dates and dollar amounts. Then, as he reached the bottom of the page, the color drained out of his face. "Dad, what is all this?" "That," I said, "is exactly how much I've spent on you two over the last 4 years. That is my retirement. That is the money your mother and I saved so we wouldn't be a burden to anyone. And that is why the transfers are over." Megan snatched the pad out of his hands, her eyes darting over the list. "This isn't even accurate," she hissed. "Some of these things were gifts. You can't just tally up gifts and throw them in our faces." "They weren't gifts, Megan," I said firmly. "They were expenses for your business. They were responsibilities that you should have handled as adults. I was just the one who made sure the doors stayed open while you two played at being important people." Leo threw the pad onto the table. It landed with a dull thud. "So that's it then? You're just cutting us off? Right when we finally have a chance to make it?" "Yes," I said. "But we're family," he shouted. "Family doesn't treat me the way you have," I replied. "Family doesn't invite influencers to a celebration and leave their own father sitting at home in the dark." Megan's voice rose to a near scream. "You're being manipulated. You've been sitting in this house alone for too long. You're isolating yourself, David. You even blocked us on social media. That's not normal behavior for someone your age." I looked at her, and I felt a wave of pity, not for myself, but for the person she was. "I blocked you because I don't need to see photos of a life I'm paying for but not allowed to share," I said. Leo swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. "The opening was just a misunderstanding, Dad. We were stressed. We'll make it up to you, I promise." "No," I said. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message. You told me exactly where I rank in your life, and I finally heard you." Then Megan said the sentence that made everything inside me go cold. She leaned in close, her eyes narrowing. "If the copper spoon fails because of this, David, if we lose everything, it'll be your fault." I stared at her for a long time. It was almost impressive, really. The sheer nerve it took to stand in a house I owned, looking at a list of money I had given them, and tell me that I was the one responsible for their failure. "My fault," I repeated softly, "because I won't keep bleeding myself dry to fund your ego? If your business can't survive without my social security check, then it's already failed, Megan. You just haven't realized it yet." Leo reached out, his voice cracking. "Dad, please. We're drowning. We need you." "You needed me last week, too," I said, walking toward the front door. "But you had a room full of important people. Go ask them for the $3,000. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Megan looked like she wanted to spit on my floor, and Leo just looked like he was seeing me for the first time in his life. Maybe he was. Maybe he'd never actually seen me as a man, just as a resource. "Mike, listen." Megan tried one last time. her voice dropping into that fake sweet tone. "If you give us this one last push, we swear, we'll start paying you back every cent starting next year." I'd heard that every year for 4 years. I didn't even bother answering. I just opened the door. "What do we do now?" Leo whispered, looking out at the street. "You figure it out," I answered. "You're adults. It's time." "You'll regret this," Megan spat as she walked past me. "I've regretted a lot of things," I said as they stepped out onto the porch. "But drawing this line isn't one of them." I watched them walk down the steps. Leo looked back once, but I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just waited until they were on the sidewalk. Then I closed the door and turned the lock. For the first time in my life, I wasn't rescuing my son. I was rescuing myself. And as that metallic click echoed through the hallway, I felt the first real victory I'd had in a long, long time. 2 days passed after I closed the door on Leo and Megan, and for a short while, the silence in my house actually felt like a gift. I had expected Leo to show up the very next morning with a rehearsed apology or for Megan to send a long, guilt-tripping email filled with spreadsheets of urgent bills. But instead, the phone stayed quiet. Even the neighborhood seemed a bit more muted, as if the world was holding its breath while I tried to figure out what my life looked like now that I wasn't a walking bank account. By the third morning, I was starting to breathe a little easier. I thought that maybe, just maybe, the message had finally sunk in. I allowed myself to believe that cutting the cord would force them to stand on their own 2 feet and that the worst of the storm was behind me. I was wrong. The doorbell rang at about 10 a.m. on Wednesday. It wasn't the aggressive pounding Leo had done earlier. This was a single, professional chime. When I opened the door, I didn't see my son or my daughter-in-law. Instead, I was looking at a stranger, a man in a sharp navy blue suit holding a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of neutral, practiced expression that usually means bad news is coming. "Mr. Michael Callahan?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "That's me," I said, my guard going up instantly. "My name is Robert Hale. I'm an attorney," he said, handing me a professional-looking card. "May I come in for a moment to discuss a private family matter?" Every instinct in my gut told me to tell him to get lost, but years of being a polite Midwesterner won out. I stepped aside and led him to the kitchen table, the same table where I had tallied up the $45,200. He sat down, clicked open his briefcase, and pulled out a thick folder. "Mr. Callahan," he began, his tone dripping with that artificial, gentle lawyer empathy. "Your son and his wife have reached out to my office because they are deeply concerned about you. They've reported some abrupt financial decisions, a sudden withdrawal from the family, and possible signs of significant mental strain." I felt a sharp, electric jolt of anger go through me, but I kept my face still. "Concerned about what, exactly?" I asked. "They're worried about your well-being, Michael," he said, sliding a form across the table toward me. "In light of your recent behavior, they've asked me to explain an option that would protect you and your assets. It's called voluntary financial guardianship." I looked down at the paper. The words seemed to jump off the page. It was a legal document that would effectively hand over control of my bank accounts, my house, and my life to Leo and Megan. "Voluntary?" I repeated, my voice tight. "Yes," Hale said, nodding smoothly. "It's a way to ensure your bills are paid and your funds are handled responsibly while you focus on your health. It's often a temporary measure, though it can become long-term if the situation requires it." I pushed the form back across the table with one finger. "I don't need a guardian, Mr. Hale. I'm perfectly capable of paying my own bills. In fact, I've been paying everyone else's bills for 4 years. That's the real financial mismanagement here." The lawyer's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the kind of smile a doctor gives you right before a painful procedure. "Michael, you certainly have the right to decline. However, I should be honest with you. If your son believes your cognitive capacity is impaired, he has the right to petition the court for an involuntary guardianship. This is simply the gentler approach." Gentle. I felt something inside me snap. The grief I had been feeling was suddenly replaced by a clean, focused rage. "Let me get this straight," I said, leaning forward. "I stopped giving them money, and suddenly I'm mentally unfit? Is that the play here? He didn't answer the question directly. They believe you are vulnerable and perhaps influenced by outside parties. They're very worried about this sudden change in your personality. It's not a change in personality, Mr. Hale. It's a return to self-respect, I said, standing up. It's healthy to say no to people who only call you when they want something. It's healthy to keep my retirement instead of pouring it into a bar that treats me like a stranger. Hale gathered his papers and stood up as well, his expression hardening. I'll let them know you're declining the voluntary option. But I must warn you, if they choose to proceed with a court filing, a judge may order a full psychiatric evaluation. Let them file, I said, walking him to the door. I've managed my life alone since my wife died. I buried her alone. I paid every bill alone. I even paid for their business alone. And now that I've stopped, you're telling me I'm incompetent? I don't think a judge is going to see it your way. I held the door open. He paused on the threshold and looked at me one last time. Mr. Callahan, if you truly have no cognitive issues, you have nothing to worry about. That's what predators always tell their prey right before they bite, I replied. His eyes flickered for a split second, and then he was gone. I watched his car pull away, and my heart was racing, but not with fear. I finally understood what I was up against. Leo and Megan weren't just looking for a handout anymore. They were looking for total control. They wanted the keys to the vault. I went back to the kitchen and picked up the phone. My hands were steady now. I dialed the number for Attorney Wells, a man I'd known through the local business association for years. Attorney Wells' office? How can we help you? The receptionist asked. I need an appointment with Mr. Wells as soon as humanly possible, I said, my voice sounding louder and firmer than it had in months. Can I ask what the nature of the issue is? She asked. I looked at the empty chair where the other lawyer had just been sitting. I thought about the son I had raised and the war he was about to start against me. My son, I said quietly, and the fact that I'm not going to let him erase me. I spent that night in my recliner, but I wasn't staring at a dark screen this time. I was making a list of every bank statement, every receipt, and every witness who had seen me work on that restaurant. I realized that if I was going to fight for my freedom, I had to stop being a supportive father and start being my own best advocate. They had just tried to lock me in a cage of my own making, but they forgot one thing. I was the one who built the cage, and I knew exactly where the exit was. The morning after the lawyer's visit, I was standing in the lobby of Wells and Hartman. It was a modest building with clean windows and a receptionist who looked like she could handle a hurricane with a single look. I gave her my name and told her I had an appointment with Mr. Wells. As I sat in the waiting room, the quiet felt heavy and deliberate, like the furniture was specifically chosen to keep people from panicking. I wasn't exactly panicking, but I had a tight feeling in my throat, like I had swallowed a stone. When Mr. Wells finally stepped out to meet me, he was the exact opposite of the vulture attorney who had come to my house. He didn't have slicked back hair or expensive accessories. He was just a steady man in his late 50s with kind eyes. His office was simple, filled with stacks of books and a box of tissues on the desk. Those tissues told me everything I needed to know about the kind of battles he fought for his clients. So, tell me what's going on, he said, settling into his chair. I took a deep breath and told him everything. I talked about the years of helping Leo, the restaurant lease, the secret grand opening, and the night Megan called me unimportant. I showed him my legal pad with the $45,200 total and explained how a lawyer had already been to my house threatening to take away my rights. Mr. Wells listened without interrupting me once. When I finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. Mr. Callahan, what your son and daughter-in-law are attempting is called financial coercion, he said. If they try to pursue guardianship based on your refusal to pay their bills, they are the ones who will be in trouble. This could be classified as elder financial exploitation. Hearing the word elder made my stomach drop, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. I wasn't just a father having a bad week. I was a man being targeted. So, what do? I asked. Wells was very specific. First, you change your locks today. Second, you freeze any co-signed credit lines. Third, you document every single time they try to contact or pressure you. And fourth, he paused, looking at me seriously, you stop speaking to them without me present. That last one felt like a slap in the face. You want me to cut off communication with my own son? I asked quietly. For your safety? Yes, he replied. It felt wrong and unnatural, like a betrayal in reverse. But I also knew deep down that this was exactly what Leo and Megan had been doing to me for years. They had cut me off emotionally until all that was left was a wallet with my name on it. Wells promised me that if they attempted any legal action, we would counter immediately with the 4 years of bank records and receipts I had collected. I left his office with a folder of instructions and a strange mix of fear and power in my chest. My next stop was the hardware store. I bought several new deadbolts. The clerk, a young guy with a warm smile, carried the items to the counter for me. Redoing the locks? He asked casually. Something like that, I said. If you need help, my dad always says it's easier with 2 people, he offered. I almost said, I'll ask my son. But the words stuck in my throat. No, I said softly. I've got it. When I got home, I set the tools on the dining table. My hands were shaking as I unpacked the first lock. I knew how to install these. I'd done it dozens of times in my life, but the symbolism of it hit me like a hammer. Changing these locks meant I was finally shutting my own child out of my life. But as I unscrewed the old deadbolt, the one I had given Leo a key to years ago, I remembered Megan's voice saying that their failure would be my fault. Suddenly, turning the screwdriver didn't feel like a tragedy. It felt necessary. Halfway through the work, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was Leo again. I let it ring until the house was quiet once more. I took a deep breath, finished tightening the last bolt on the front door, and stepped back. For the first time in years, my home belonged only to me. That small metallic click of the new lock felt like my first real victory. I thought changing the locks would give me instant peace. For about 36 hours, it did. No calls, no knocks, no lawyers. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and a feeling of safety I hadn't felt in a long time. Then Wednesday morning arrived. I was sitting with my coffee when an unfamiliar black SUV with tinted windows pulled up in front of the house. My stomach tightened up instantly. I thought maybe it was Megan coming back for round 2. But it was 2 men in gray shirts with laminated badges and clipboards. They looked like they worked for the utility company. I went outside to meet them. Morning, I called out. Can I help you with something? The taller one didn't even look up from his clipboard. Michael Callahan? Yes, I said. Got a work order here, he said, tapping the page. Gas shut off. My heart skipped a beat. Gas shut off? For what reason? Failure to pay, he replied with a shrug. That's impossible, I told him, stepping closer. My bill is on autopay. It always has been. The man hesitated, then showed me the order. The name and address were mine, but the overdue balance wasn't. It was for the restaurant's account. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what had happened. Someone had submitted a fraudulent request to shift the business's debt onto my personal residential account. They were hoping the system would just shut me down before I could ask any questions. You're not touching that meter, I said firmly. Not until I call the company myself. The shorter technician whispered something about me being another person who didn't want to admit they were behind on bills. But I ignored him. I dialed customer service, and luckily, a representative picked up quickly. Mr. Callahan, she said after checking my records. Your account is in perfect standing. There are no shut-off requests on your file. Then where did the order come from? I asked. She paused for a long time. It looks like it was initiated from a linked account listed under the Copper Spoon LLC. My stomach dropped. Leo and Megan hadn't just threatened me with a lawyer. They were now actively trying to sabotage my house. They were testing to see how much chaos they could, 'cause if I didn't give in. I told the woman the request was unauthorized, and she canceled it immediately, marking my account as verified owner only. When I hung up, the technicians were already walking back to their truck. Dispatch says hold off, the tall one muttered. Must have been a glitch. Yeah, I said, watching them drive away. A glitch. But I knew better. It was a warning shot. I went back inside and called Mr. Wells. They tried to shut off my gas, I told him. There was a long silence on the other end. They're testing your perimeter, Wells said. They're looking for weak spots. This means they're preparing to escalate. Escalate, I whispered. This isn't just about the money anymore, Mike, he said. This is about control. People like your daughter-in-law do not accept being cut off. They punish. So what do I do next? Now, Wells said, his voice hardening. You start protecting yourself like a man going to war. I hated that word, war. It felt too heavy and dramatic. But as I looked at the new locks on my door and the legal papers on my table, I realized that's exactly what it was. A war that my own son had started, and one I could no longer avoid. ## Part 6. The Shadows of Desperation. The morning after the utility company incident, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that hadn't been there for a long time. It wasn't the sharp, stabbing grief I felt when Martha passed away. It was something colder and much more unsettling. It was the realization that my own son had crossed a line that I could never uncross for him. Outside, the weather seemed to match my mood perfectly. It was raining. Not a gentle spring shower, but a steady, gray curtain of water that soaked the streets and made the whole neighborhood look washed out and tired. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time, watching the raindrops race down the glass, wondering how my life had turned into a literal battlefield between me and the child I had raised. At about 9:30 a.m., there was a soft knock on my door. It wasn't the aggressive, entitled rhythm that Leo used, and it certainly wasn't the sharp, professional knock of a lawyer. It was hesitant and gentle. I opened the door to find Mrs. Gable, my neighbor from 2 houses down, standing there under a large umbrella, clutching a covered plate. "Morning, David," she said with a kind, concerned smile. "I heard some raised voices over here the other day, and I just wanted to check in and see if you were doing okay." Her eyes were full of that quiet decency that you only see in people who have lived a lot of life. I invited her in, warning her about the wet floor from my boots. She sat down at the table and set the plate between us. "Cinnamon rolls," she said softly. "They're still warm. I thought you might need something sweet today." As we sat there, I found myself opening up to her. I told her about the restaurant, the grand opening I wasn't invited to, the missing money, the lawyer who showed up on my porch, and the fake utility shut-off. Mrs. Gable's eyebrows climbed higher with every word I spoke. "Oh, David," she whispered, reaching out to pat my hand. "That isn't just ungrateful behavior. That's dangerous." "I know," I said, feeling the weight of the admission. "But he's my son." She looked me square in the eye. "And you're a man who deserves better than being used as a human piggy bank." Those words hit me harder than any legal threat ever could. No one else had said it so plainly. Not the bank manager, not even my own lawyer. But hearing it from a neighbor, a retired school teacher who had seen it all, made something small and tight inside my chest finally loosen up. "You aren't alone, David," she added firmly. "Nobody gets to bully you out of your own life." She then hesitated, looking down at her tea before continuing. "You know, we've all seen things over the years. Your boy, well, he hasn't exactly treated you the way a son should treat a father." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I never wanted to say anything because it wasn't my place," she sighed. "But there were nights, late ones, when Leo and Megan would be sitting out front in their car arguing quite loudly. Every time they did, your name came up." "My name?" I asked, feeling a chill. "Oh, yes," she said. "They'd say things like, 'He'll pay for it,' or 'Just ask David, he won't say no.' You weren't a father to them, David. To them, you were just an account number with a heartbeat." Felt like a physical punch to the gut. It wasn't really news. I had suspected it for a long time, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it impossible to ignore. After she left, the silence of the kitchen felt heavier than before. I sat there for a long time, thinking about how I had been viewed by the people I loved most. My phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It wasn't a name I recognized, just a local number. Curiosity got the better of me and I answered. "Hello, is this Mr. Callahan?" A calm, male voice asked. "Yes, it is," I said tentatively. "This is Detective Miller with Community Safety Services," he said. "I'm calling because we received an anonymous concern about your well-being." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. I knew exactly what was happening. This was the next step in their plan. "Let me guess," I said, my voice sounding exhausted and bitter. "My son or his wife told you that I'm confused, acting strange, or that I'm isolated." There was a brief pause on the line. "Well," the detective said carefully, "the report mentioned some abrupt behavior changes and concerning financial decisions. We just want to make sure you aren't being coerced by anyone." I actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Detective, I'm the one finally escaping coercion," I told him. "Not the other way around." He asked if he could stop by for a quick welfare check, just to document that I was safe and competent. I looked around my tidy kitchen, at the new locks I had installed, and the legal documents stacked neatly on the table. I had nothing to hide. "Come on over," I said. 20 minutes later, Detective Miller was in my kitchen. He was a man with a calm, professional presence. He took in the order of the house, the coffee mug, and the way I spoke. I told him everything. Every dollar I'd spent, every manipulation I'd endured, and the threats that had been made against me. He didn't interrupt. He just listened and took notes. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Mr. Callahan, you are not only competent. You are more clear-headed than most of the people I talk to in a week. I'm going to close this case immediately." A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "But you need to understand something. When people like your son and his wife feel their access to money slipping away, they get desperate. And desperation almost always leads to escalation." "That's exactly what my lawyer said," I murmured. "He's right," the detective said. "They will try again. But next time they won't use a fake utility bill or a welfare check. They'll go bigger." "Bigger?" I asked quietly. He held my gaze. "Expect them to take this to court." As he walked out the door, I felt the walls of my life closing in just a little bit more. They weren't done. Not even close. The next battle wouldn't be fought on my porch or in my kitchen. It would be fought in front of a judge. 3 weeks went by after Detective Miller left my house, and for a while, I almost allowed myself to believe that the worst was over. There was a heavy, strange silence from Leo and Megan. No more pounding on the door, no more frantic messages, and no more lawyers in suits trying to talk their way into my kitchen. But I knew people like them didn't just give up. They regrouped. I spent those weeks following every single instruction Attorney Wells had given me. I updated every password on my bank accounts, moved a good portion of my savings to a completely different bank, and started a thick, color-coded binder where I filed every suspicious car that drove too slowly past my porch. At night, I'd sit in my living room with just one lamp on, watching the streetlights reflect off the wet pavement, waiting for the next blow to fall. The morning it finally happened was a Thursday, a bright, sunny day that felt far too peaceful for what was about to occur. I was out in the front yard, minding my own business and trimming the hedges, when a white sedan pulled up right behind my mailbox. A woman in her mid-30s stepped out. She was dressed professionally with her hair pulled back in a tight, no-nonsense bun, carrying a clipboard. She walked up my driveway with a stride that told me she wasn't there to sell me anything. "Mr. David Callahan?" she asked. When I nodded, she reached into a folder and pulled out a packet of papers that was nearly as thick as a paperback novel. "You've been served," she said flatly. Those 2 words felt like a physical punch to my gut. My fingers felt numb as I took the papers from her. When I asked what they were for, she didn't even blink. She told me it was a petition for legal guardianship filed by my son and daughter-in-law. She pointed out that the court date was set for 3 weeks away and had me sign a form acknowledging that I'd received them. Then she just turned around, got back in her car, and disappeared. I walked back into my house, locked every single one of those new deadbolts I had installed, and sat down at the dining room table. I stared at the front page for a long time before I had the courage to open it. When I finally did, the first thing I saw was a request to declare me mentally incompetent. It was signed by Leo and Megan. I started flipping through the pages, and it only got uglier. There was an exhibit that listed my supposed erratic behavior. They claimed I was making sudden financial decisions without any logic, that I had become paranoid about my own family, and that I was isolating myself. They even pointed to my obsessive record-keeping and the excessive security measures I'd taken, meaning the very locks I'd installed to keep them out were now being used as proof that I was crazy. Then I hit Exhibit B, which was a list of witness statements. There was a statement from Mr. Davis, a neighbor who'd had a grudge against me for years, claiming I spent my afternoons yelling at imaginary people on my lawn. He conveniently left out the part where I was actually telling the utility workers not to touch my meter. There was also a note from a local pharmacist claiming I frequently forgot my own prescriptions. I knew Megan must have tricked or pressured him into signing something he didn't fully understand. The worst part, though, was the section on financial mismanagement. They listed the large withdrawals I'd made, the very money they had begged me for, as evidence that I didn't know how to handle my finances. They even claimed I was allowing dangerous individuals into my home. When I realized they were talking about Detective Miller and my own lawyer, my blood ran cold. Anyone who tried to help me was being painted as a predator. I flipped to the final section where they listed the requested action. They wanted full guardianship over every single aspect of my life. My money, my medical care, and my legal rights. They wanted Leo to be the primary guardian and Megan to be the secondary one. For several minutes, I honestly couldn't breathe. The house felt like it was shrinking around me. If they won this, I would effectively stop being a person in the eyes of the law. I wouldn't be able to sign a check, choose my own doctor, sell my house, or even go to the grocery store without their permission. I wouldn't even be allowed to defend myself legally without their approval. They would own me. My hands were shaking so hard the papers were rattling, but I managed to pick up the phone and call Attorney Wells. He picked up on the first ring. When I told him they had actually filed it, I could hear him inhale sharply. "It's bad, isn't it?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Don't panic, David," he said, his voice firm and steady. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not talk to anyone about this. Do not answer the phone if they call, and do not acknowledge this publicly. I want you to bring that entire packet to my office right now." "I can't believe he really did this," I said, mostly to myself. "I can," Wells replied quietly. "And because I expected it, I know exactly how we're going to fight it. Right now, you need to take a breath and get down here." I hung up the phone, grabbed the folder, and stood in my hallway for a moment, just staring at the front door. This wasn't about the $45,000 anymore. This was about my survival as a free man. My own son was trying to erase my life piece by piece, and he was trying to do it legally and permanently. I felt a clarity that was sharper than any pain I'd ever experienced. This fight was going to determine how the rest of my years on this earth were going to look. I wasn't just defending my bank account. I was defending my right to exist. As I walked out to my truck, I felt a new kind of resolve. I was ready. I drove to Attorney Wells' office with that guardianship packet sitting on the passenger seat like a live explosive. Every stoplight felt like it lasted an eternity, and every time I saw a car in my rearview mirror, I found myself wondering if Leo or Megan were following me, watching to see where I'd go next. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my palms were slick with sweat, and my heart was thumping against my ribs. Wells was waiting for me right at the front desk. He didn't smile or offer a polite greeting. He just looked at me with the expression of a man who had seen this kind of betrayal more times than he cared to count. We went into his office, and I set that thick packet down on his desk like I was dropping a body bag. He adjusted his glasses and started reading. He went through page after page, exhibit after exhibit, lie after lie. I sat there in silence, watching the lines on his forehead deepen with every minute that passed. After about 20 minutes, he pushed the papers aside and let out a long, loud exhale. "Well," he said, looking at me over his spectacles, "they certainly threw everything they had at the wall to see what would stick. Can they win?" I asked. My voice sounded much thinner and more fragile than I wanted it to. Wells leaned back and tapped a pen against his chin. If you hadn't come to me when you did, if you didn't have a paper trail, and if you really were as isolated as they claim, then yes, they could win. He opened a folder on his desk labeled Callahan Defense and flipped through it. But you aren't alone, and you're certainly not confused. I started building this file the moment you told me about that first lawyer visit. Now, we just have to expand it. He told me he needed everything. Every bank record, every transfer receipt, every text message, and every voicemail. He wanted timestamps and screenshots to drown them in their own greed. Then he started listing the witnesses we'd need to call. Mrs. Howard from down the street, Detective Miller who performed the welfare check, the bank manager Luis Lopez, and even the utility representative who helped me stop the fraudulent shutoff. He even planned to call the pharmacist who had been tricked into signing that statement against me. For the next hour, we mapped out a plan that felt more like a military operation than a legal defense. The centerpiece was going to be a formal psychiatric evaluation by a specialist Wells trusted, Dr. Rachel Simmons. They built a case out of thin air, Wells said firmly. We're going to build ours out of concrete. I asked him what would happen if the judge believed their lies first. Wells steepled his fingers and explained that guardianship judges see real decline every day, but they also see greedy children more often than I'd believe. He told me that Leo and Megan had created a pattern of behavior so obvious it practically glowed in the dark. He gave me strict orders. Do not answer their calls, do not let them on my property, and if they showed up in person, I was to call the police immediately. Before I left, he looked at me with genuine concern. You need real support right now, David. Not just legal support, but emotional support. You've been surviving on your own for far too long. Later that afternoon, after I'd dropped off the documents he requested, I decided to take a walk around the block. It was something I hadn't done just for myself in years, without worrying about a restaurant bill or a phone call from Leo. As I passed Mrs. Howard's house, she waved me over to her porch and offered me some peach iced tea. In her quiet backyard, surrounded by the smell of fresh grass and the sound of wind chimes, I finally told her the whole truth about the court papers. They underestimated you, David, she said, her voice warm but fierce. That's their biggest mistake. Sitting there with her, I realized she saw me as a person, not as a wallet, not as a burden, and not as an obligation. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly seen. That small, gentle moment with a neighbor did more to strengthen my resolve than any legal strategy could. I didn't feel like I was fighting this battle alone anymore. A few days later, I went to see Dr. Simmons for the psychiatric evaluation. Her office was peaceful, filled with soft light and plants. She asked me to tell her in my own words why I was there. I told her about the $45,200, the wedding I wasn't invited to, and the way my own son was trying to take my life away from me. She didn't look at me with pity. She looked angry on my behalf. Mr. Callahan, she said, I evaluate seniors every single week. You aren't just competent, you're sharper than most 40-year-olds I know. That is going in my report, in bold. When Wells called me 2 days later to go over the final strategy, I felt a physical change in my posture. My house had turned into a command center, filled with binders and color-coded files. For years, Leo and Megan had made me feel like I was the one losing my grip. Now I saw the truth. They were the ones unraveling, and they were trying to pull me down with them to save themselves. Wells walked me through the order of the hearing. Dr. Simmons would go first, followed by the detective, the utility rep, the bank manager, and my neighbors. And finally, Wells said, it'll be your turn. Your testimony will make or break this case. Are you ready to tell the truth? I didn't hesitate for a second. Yes. Good, he said. Because they're going to attack your character and your memory. They'll try to make you look emotional and confused. Let them try, I replied. As I walked back to my truck that evening, the sun was setting in streaks of orange and red over my street. For the first time since this nightmare began, the fear didn't have a grip on me. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a man who was prepared, supported, and frankly furious. I went inside, locked my door, turned off the porch light, and whispered to the empty hallway, "Let them come. I'm ready." The morning of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt like the world was holding its breath before a storm. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., and after a slow breakfast, I put on the suit I had worn to Martha's funeral. It wasn't about looking nice. It was armor. As I tightened my tie, my hands shook. Not because I was scared, but because of a deep grief for the son I thought I had raised. When I arrived at the courthouse, Attorney Wells was waiting by the security checkpoint with a coffee in his hand. "You ready?" he asked. I told him I'd been ready for years. Just then, I saw them at the end of the hallway. Leo was in a brand new suit, looking like he was the victim, while Megan was dressed in somber black, as if she were attending a funeral. She looked at me with a mix of pity and cold calculation. We filed into the courtroom like two armies. The judge, a woman named Harper, had silver hair and sharp glasses. She looked like someone who had zero patience for nonsense. Their lawyer started things off by painting a picture of me as a confused, erratic old man who was being manipulated by predatory influences, meaning my own friends and lawyer. Then came the testimonies. Leo stood up and feigned deep worry, lying with a smoothness that made my stomach turn. He claimed I was forgetful and overreactive. Megan was even worse. She actually told the judge I thought the restaurant opening was cursed. They even brought up the neighbor, Mr. Davis, who claimed I yelled at phantoms in my yard. It was all smoke and mirrors. But then it was our turn. Attorney Wells called Dr. Simmons to the stand. She was like a one-woman firing squad. She testified clearly and professionally that I was emotionally stable, mentally sharp, and fully capable of managing my own life. You could see Leo and Megan stiffen in their seats as the mentally incompetent narrative began to crumble. Detective Miller followed her, explaining that the welfare check he performed showed a perfectly orderly home and a clear-headed man. He even noted that the initial report about me seemed fabricated. Then the utility representative and the bank manager, Luis Lopez, took the stand. They confirmed that the only erratic or fraudulent behavior they saw came from Leo and Megan, not me. The most powerful moment, though, was when Mrs. Gable spoke. She didn't use legal jargon. She just told the simple truth. "David is one of the most capable men I know," she told the judge. "But for years, his son has treated him like a debit card with a heartbeat. You could have heard a pin drop after that." Finally, I took the stand. I didn't yell or get dramatic. I just told the truth about the $45,200, the secret opening, the fraudulent bills, and the heartbreak of realizing your own child sees you as a resource instead of a person. When I finished, Judge Harper was quiet for a long time, reviewing her notes. The silence in that room was heavy. When she finally looked up, her eyes were like steel. She spoke about how guardianship is a serious matter that strips a person of their basic rights. Then she looked directly at Leo and Megan. "I find no evidence of cognitive decline or mismanagement by Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice echoing through the room. She picked up the thick packet of lies they had filed and set it down with a loud final thud. "I see a troubling pattern here," she continued. "But it isn't from the father. It is a pattern of manipulation and financial dependency from the petitioners." She didn't just deny their petition. She went a step further. She referred the case to Adult Protective Services for a review of attempted elder financial exploitation. Leo looked like he'd been struck. Megan turned white as a sheet. The judge's gavel came down with a crack that sounded like thunder. Hearing adjourned. Outside the courthouse, the air felt incredibly clean. Wells gave me a firm nod. "You did it, David," he said. I corrected him. "We did it." He told me to go home and finally rest, that I was safe now. As I walked toward my truck, Leo approached me. He looked lost, like a child who had finally run out of excuses. "Dad, you didn't have to do this," he whispered. I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to fix his problems. "No, Leo," I said firmly. "You didn't have to do this. I helped you for years, but the moment you tried to steal my life, I stopped being a father with a wallet." He asked if we could fix it, but I just shook my head. "Not until you learn to live without me," I told him. I watched him and Megan walk away, not as a power couple, but as two people whose scheme had finally collapsed. 3 months had passed since that day in the courthouse, and the world looked completely different to me now. It's funny how you can live in one place for decades and think you're rooted there forever, but then a single event happens that makes you realize those roots were actually just chains. The old brick house, the one I had spent years maintaining, the one filled with the ghosts of Leo's childhood and the heavy obligations of his adulthood, was no longer my home. It was just a building. I sold it about 6 weeks after the hearing. Selling it was one of the hardest and yet most refreshing things I've ever done. I watched the new owners, a young couple with a toddler, walk through the rooms with excitement in their eyes, and I realized they were going to fill the space with new memories that didn't involve bank statements or legal threats. I took what I needed: Martha's crochet blankets, my favorite old recliner, the one with the duct tape, and my painting supplies, and I left the rest behind. I moved downtown into a sunny apartment that looks right over the river. It's smaller, sure, but the windows are massive, and they let in more light than that old house ever did. Every morning, I wake up when I feel like it, not because an alarm is going off or because I'm bracing for a phone call from a panicked son. I pour myself a cup of coffee and sit on my small balcony, tending to a little garden of herbs and flowers that I never had the time or energy to care for before. My daily routine has become my sanctuary. There's a small cafe just 2 blocks away where the baristas already know my name and exactly how I like my coffee. I walk there every morning, feeling the cool river breeze on my face. It's a simple pleasure, but for someone who spent the last 4 years feeling like a prisoner in his own life, it feels like a miracle. I've joined a men's volunteer group at the local community center, where we help repair old furniture for families in need. It turns out, when you use your hands to help people who actually appreciate it, those calluses don't feel like a burden anymore. They feel like a badge of honor. I also started painting again. For years, I had tucked my easels and brushes away in the basement, telling myself I was too busy or that it was a waste of time. But now, in the afternoon light of my new apartment, I find myself lost in the colors. I don't paint for anyone else. I don't paint to sell. I paint because it's a part of me that I had allowed to go dark, and now the lights are finally back on. I sometimes take weekend trips now, too. I'll just pick a direction and drive, visiting small towns or parks that Martha and I always talked about seeing but never got around to. I don't have to check my account balance every 5 minutes to see if a check for a restaurant's industrial oven has cleared. I don't have to wonder if I'm bleeding myself dry for someone else's dream. I'm finally living my own. I haven't heard much from Leo or Megan lately. From what I've gathered through the neighborhood grapevine, the restaurant didn't last much longer after the funding stopped. Apparently, the important people weren't quite as interested in helping out when they were asked to actually put up their own money. I've heard they moved across the state to try something else, likely chasing another dream that they expect someone else to pay for. But for the first time in 35 years, that isn't my problem to solve. The Adult Protective Services review that the judge ordered was a turning point, too. It forced Leo and Megan to stay far away from my finances and my life. It was the legal boundary I needed, but the emotional boundary was the one I built myself. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not even grieving that much. You can't mourn a relationship that was built on a lie, and I finally accepted that I was loving a version of my son that he chose to stop being a long time ago. One evening, as the sun was melting into the river, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and gold, I sat down in front of a blank canvas. I didn't have a plan. I just dipped my brush into a tube of cobalt blue and made the first stroke. Felt like a fresh start. Felt like air. I realized then that I wasn't just safe. I was free. The kind of freedom you don't expect to find at 68 years old. But the kind that is all the sweeter because you know exactly what it costs to get it. I've stopped being a safety net, a bank, or an unimportant person in a room full of influencers. I looked at my reflection in the window, seeing a man who had been through a war and come out the other side with his soul intact. I dipped the brush again, the colors spreading across the white surface, vibrant and bold. A new life needs new colors, and I have plenty of them now. My name is David Callahan, I whispered to the quiet room, a small smile playing on my lips. I'm 68 years old, and for the first time in my life, I finally belong to myself. And that is more than enough.